Steve Harvey does not end shows early. In all his years hosting Family Feud, through every awkward answer, every emotional breakdown, and every family drama that spilled onto his stage, he has always found a way to keep going. The show goes on. That is the rule. But on a November evening in 2026, Steve Harvey broke his own rule. A wife confronted her husband about his affair on live television, and the confrontation was so raw, so honest, and so profoundly human that Steve looked at his producers, looked at the cameras, and made a decision that had never been made in the history of the show. He ended the taping early. Not because of a technical problem, not because of a safety concern, because what was happening on his stage was too important, too real, and too sacred to be squeezed back into a game show format. He ended the show because the family in front of him needed the cameras to stop, and Steve Harvey, the man who had built his career in front of cameras, chose the family over the broadcast. There was a time when television stopped for nothing. There was a time when the show always went on, no matter what. But when Grace Holloway looked her husband in the eyes and said the words she had been holding for 11 months, Steve Harvey realized that some moments do not belong to television. Some moments belong to the people living them, and the most respectful thing a host can do is recognize when the cameras are no longer serving the story and shut them off. What happened in the minutes before Steve made that call, and what he said to the family after, became one of the most quietly powerful moments of his career, not because it was loud, because it was the moment Steve Harvey chose silence over content, humanity over ratings, and a family's privacy over a viral clip. If you believe that some truths are too important for entertainment, and that the measure of a person is what they do when the cameras should stop rolling, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. What happens on this stage, and the decision Steve Harvey makes because of it, is unlike anything that has ever occurred on Family Feud. Grace Holloway was 40 years old. She was from Durham, North Carolina, the daughter of a Baptist minister named Reverend Thomas Avery and a hospice nurse named Diane Avery. Grace grew up in two worlds that shaped her into the woman she became. Her father's world was the pulpit, a place of public declaration, where truth was spoken to congregations and the weight of words was measured by their ability to change hearts. Her mother's world was the bedside, a place of private witness, where truth was whispered to dying patients and the weight of words was measured by their ability to bring peace. Grace learned from her father that truth must be spoken. She learned from her mother that some truths must be spoken gently. She would need both lessons on the same night. Diane Avery had a particular wisdom that came from spending 22 years sitting with people in the last hours of their lives. She told Grace once, during a long drive home from the hospital after a particularly difficult shift, "Baby, the people who are dying almost never regret the things they said. They regret the things they did not say. They regret the conversations they were too afraid to have. The truths they swallowed to keep the peace. The words they held back because they thought there would be more time. There is never more time. There is only now." Grace was 16 when she heard that. She carried the lesson for 24 years before she used it on a game show stage. Grace earned a degree in social work from North Carolina Central University and spent her career working as a family counselor at a community mental health center in Durham. She sat in small rooms with families in crisis. She listened to couples argue, to parents grieve, to teenagers rage against the people who loved them the most. She helped families find the words for the things they could not say on their own. She mediated. She translated. She held space for the pain that people brought into her office and helped them find a way through it. Her colleagues said Grace had a gift for sitting in discomfort without rushing to fix it. She could tolerate the silence between the revelation and the response, the gap where most people panicked and filled the air with noise. Grace let the gap breathe, because her mother had taught her that the gap was where healing began. She met Nathan Holloway at a friend's wedding when she was 27. Nathan was 30, a civil engineer who designed bridges and overpasses for the State Department of Transportation. He was methodical, reserved, and precise in a way that appealed to Grace, whose professional life was immersed in emotional chaos. Nathan represented structure, reliability, The kind of man who measured things twice before cutting once. He was the bridge builder, Grace was the bridge crosser. Together, they made sense. They married after 3 years of dating. The ceremony was at Reverend Avery's church, a red brick building in downtown Durham that had been the spiritual home of Grace's family for 4 generations. Diane sat in the front row and held a single white rose, the same flower she placed on the beds of patients who had passed peacefully. It was her symbol of a life well lived, and she brought it to the wedding as her blessing. Reverend Avery performed the ceremony himself, and when he reached the vows, he paused and looked at Nathan with the direct, measuring gaze of a man who had spent 40 years studying the distance between what people promised and what they delivered. Nathan returned the gaze without flinching. He said his vows with the careful precision of an engineer reading specifications. Every word measured, every promise exact. For the first 10 years, the marriage was strong. They settled in a house in a quiet Durham neighborhood. They had 2 children. Their daughter, Naomi, was now 12, perceptive and empathetic, with her mother's ability to read the emotional atmosphere of any room and her grandfather Reverend Avery's gift for naming what she observed. Their son, Caleb, was 9, creative and physical, who built elaborate structures out of anything he could find, and who had his father's engineer's mind and his grandmother Diane's gentleness. Grace continued counseling families at the mental health center. Nathan's career advanced, and he was promoted to a senior design role that included overseeing multi-year construction projects across the state. The projects required Nathan to spend more time at remote sites, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. Grace understood. Infrastructure work was unpredictable. Bridges did not build themselves on convenient schedules. She managed the household alone during those stretches, maintained her caseload at the clinic, and kept the children's lives stable and predictable. She did not complain. She did not question. She trusted Nathan the way she trusted the structures he designed. Completely, because an engineer who built things people drove across every day would not build a marriage on an unstable foundation. Or so she believed. 11 months before the Family Feud taping, Diane Avery died. She was 67. A stroke took her suddenly, between one heartbeat and the next, the way she had always said she wanted to go. No lingering, no suffering, just here and then not. Grace held her mother's hand in the emergency room and felt the warmth leave it. Reverend Avery stood beside his daughter and prayed the only prayer he could manage, which was his wife's name, repeated until it became a melody. In the weeks after Diane's death, Grace began going through her mother's belongings. Diane had kept meticulous journals throughout her nursing career, documenting the final conversations of the patients she had attended. Grace spent evenings reading them, finding comfort in her mother's handwriting and in the wisdom that filled every page. One entry, written by Diane 6 years earlier, stopped Grace cold. It read, "Today a woman told me on her deathbed that she had known about her husband's affair for 20 years and had never said a word. She said the silence was heavier than the dying. She said she wished she had spoken when she had the chance. I held her hand and I promised her that I would tell my daughters to never carry a truth they are afraid to speak. The weight will kill you faster than any disease." Grace read that entry 3 times. Then she put the journal down, walked to the kitchen, and opened Nathan's laptop. She did not know what she was looking for. She was not snooping. She was following an instinct that had been building for months, the same instinct her mother had taught her to trust in the hospice room. The instinct that said something was wrong and that the time to find out was now, because there was never more time. There was only now. What Grace found on Nathan's laptop confirmed what the instinct had been whispering. Emails. Detailed, intimate, sustained correspondence with a woman in Raleigh that stretched back over 2 years. The emails described meetings, trips planned around his construction site visits, and a relationship that was emotional, physical, and ongoing. Grace read every email. She did not cry. She sat in the kitchen in the silence her mother had taught her to tolerate, and she let the gap breathe. She told one person, Reverend Avery. She sat in her father's study, surrounded by 40 years of sermon notes, and she placed the printed emails on his desk. The old minister read them with the same focused attention he brought to Scripture. When he finished, he looked at his daughter and said, Your mother told you that the people who are dying regret the things they did not say. You are not dying, Grace. But your marriage is. What are you going to say? Grace said, I am going to say it in front of everyone, because Mama also taught me that some truths need a witness, and I want witnesses. The Family Feud appearance had been planned for months. The team was Nathan, Grace, Reverend Avery, Grace's younger sister Jeanette, and Grace's colleague from the clinic, a therapist named Wanda. Reverend Avery, now 71, came because Grace asked and because he had been standing behind his daughter since the day she was born and was not about to stop now. He packed his Bible and his reading glasses. Grace packed the emails. The Holloway team was matched against the Chen family from San Francisco, a Chinese-American family of 5 whose matriarch was a retired math professor who approached every question with algorithmic precision and whose rapid-fire answers had the audience laughing before the first round was over. The studio energy was bright and competitive. During introductions, Nathan delivered his line with the measured confidence of an engineer presenting a project summary. Steve, this is my wife, Grace. 13 years of marriage. She is a family counselor. She helps families through their hardest days. And she is the strongest person I have ever known. He looked at Grace when he said it. Grace looked back. The audience applauded warmly. Reverend Avery stood at the end of the lineup with his hands folded in front of him, his Bible in his inside jacket pocket, his expression carrying the particular gravity of a man who knew what was coming and had prayed about it. The game moved through the first 2 rounds without incident. The Holloways won 1 and lost 1. Nathan was steady and analytical. Grace was warm and thoughtful. Reverend Avery delivered one answer with such homiletic authority that Steve Harvey said, Reverend, that was not an answer, that was a sermon. Avery responded, Every answer should be a sermon, Mr. Harvey. The audience loved it. The 3rd round arrived. Steve read the question. We asked 100 married people, what is the one conversation every couple avoids but should have? Grace was up for the face-off. She hit the buzzer. She looked at Steve Harvey, and in her eyes was the same focused compassion she brought to her counseling room when a client was about to say the hardest thing they had ever said. Grace had sat with hundreds of people at that exact threshold. Now she was standing on it herself. The conversation about whether the marriage is honest, Grace said. Her voice was calm but layered with a resonance that made the words feel heavier than their syllables. It was not on the board. That did not matter. Grace turned to Nathan. We have never had that conversation, Nathan. In 13 years we have never asked each other whether this marriage is honest. So I am asking now. Is it? Because I read the emails 11 months ago. The ones to the woman in Raleigh. 2 years of emails, Nathan. 2 years of planning meetings around your construction sites. 2 years of a relationship that existed inside our marriage without my knowledge or consent. I found them on your laptop the week after my mother died, while I was reading her journals and finding the strength to finally open my eyes. The studio went quiet with a completeness that felt physical. 200 people inhaled and did not exhale. The Chen family across the stage went still. Wanda closed her eyes briefly, the trained stillness of a therapist who was watching a session unfold in the most public setting imaginable. Jeanette, Grace's sister, reached out and placed her hand on Grace's back. Nathan stood in the family lineup. The transformation was slow and total, like watching a structure lose its load-bearing capacity. The engineered composure he had maintained all day dissolved incrementally. His jaw loosened. His shoulders dropped. His hands, the hands that designed bridges, hung at his sides with nothing to hold onto. Grace continued. Her voice did not waver. It was the voice of a family counselor delivering the truth in the way she had been trained to deliver it. With compassion, with clarity, without rescue. My mother spent 22 years sitting with dying people. The last thing she wrote in her journal before she died was about a woman who carried the knowledge of her husband's affair for 20 years in silence and said the silence was heavier than the dying. My mother wrote that she wanted to teach her daughters to never carry a truth they were afraid to speak. She wrote that the weight would kill you faster than any disease. Grace's eyes filled but her voice held. I found those emails 1 week after I buried my mother. 1 week. I was sitting in the kitchen reading her journals looking for comfort, and I found a passage that told me to open my eyes. So I opened them, and I found 2 years of lies on a laptop in my own kitchen. I have been carrying this for 11 months, Nathan, and my mother would be furious with me for carrying it that long. So I am putting it down. Right here. Right now, in front of my father, my sister, and these witnesses. Because Mama said some truths need a witness, and I need witnesses. Reverend Avery had not moved from his position at the end of the lineup. His hands were still folded, his face was still, but his eyes, the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching congregations absorb hard truths, were glistening. He was watching his daughter do the hardest thing she had ever done, and he was standing exactly where he had always stood, behind her. Steve Harvey had been listening from near his podium. He had not spoken since Grace began. He had not moved. He had done what Grace's mother had taught her to do in the counseling room. He had let the gap breathe. He had tolerated the silence between the revelation and the response. And now, standing on his stage with tears forming in his eyes, he did something that no host had ever done in the history of Family Feud. He turned to the production booth. He looked at the head producer, and he said, quietly but firmly, "We are done for the day. In the show. Turn the cameras off. This family needs the room." The production crew hesitated for a moment. Then the head producer nodded. The studio lights shifted. The cameras powered down one by one. The audience, 200 people who had just witnessed something they would never forget, sat in a silence that was not awkward but reverent. They understood. What was happening on that stage was no longer theirs to watch. It belonged to the Holloway family, and Steve Harvey had given it back to them. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling was not captured on film. The details that emerged came from interviews given weeks later by family members and from Steve Harvey himself, who spoke about it publicly at a charity event. But the broad outlines were consistent across every account. Steve Harvey stepped off the stage and walked into the audience seating area. He sat down in an empty chair in the front row. He did not leave. He did not go to his dressing room. He sat in the audience and gave the family the stage, not as a host, as a witness. Because Grace had said she needed witnesses, and Steve decided that even with the cameras off, he would be one. On the stage with the bright television lights replaced by the softer work lights, Grace and Nathan stood facing each other for the first time without an audience, without cameras, without the apparatus of entertainment surrounding them. Reverend Avery remained at the end of the lineup, his hands still folded, giving his daughter the space to do what she needed to do. Jeanette stood beside Grace. Wanda stood near Reverend Avery, the professional and the pastoral flanking the family like sentinels. Nathan spoke first. Without the cameras, without the audience's energy, without the performance pressure, what came out was stripped and raw. He told Grace he was sorry. He told her the affair had started during a long construction project in Raleigh when he was isolated and lonely, and that it had continued because he was too much of a coward to end it or confess it. He did not blame Grace. He did not make excuses about the marriage being distant or difficult. He said, "I built a bridge in Raleigh and I destroyed the one at home, and I do not know how to fix a bridge I designed to fail." Grace listened. She did what she did in her counseling room. She sat in the discomfort without rushing to fix it. She let the gap breathe, and when Nathan was finished, she said something that everyone present would later describe as the most Grace-like thing she could have said. She said, "Nathan, I am not going to fix this for us the way I fix things for my clients. I am going to feel this. I am going to hurt. And I am going to decide what comes next when I am ready. Not now, not tonight. When I am ready, and you are going to wait, because waiting is the least you owe me after 2 years of lies." Reverend Avery spoke next. He walked to the center of the stage, the way he walked to the center of his pulpit every Sunday, and he addressed both his daughter and his son-in-law. What he said was later shared by Jeanette in an interview, and it was described by Wanda as the most therapeutically sound statement she had ever heard a non-therapist deliver. "Nathan, I married you and my daughter in my church. I asked God to bless your union, and you took that blessing and you broke it. I am not going to tell you what to do. That is not my place. But I am going to tell you what I told my congregation last Sunday. Repentance is not a speech. Repentance is a direction. It is the choice to turn around and walk the other way. You have been walking in the wrong direction for 2 years. The question is not whether you are sorry. The question is whether you are willing to turn around, and only time will answer that. He turned to Grace. Your mother is not here, but I am, and I am telling you what she would tell you if she could. Do not carry this in silence. You already spoke the truth. Now let the truth do its work. You do not have to decide anything tonight. You just have to keep breathing. And I will be breathing right beside you for as long as you need me. Steve Harvey, sitting in the front row of the audience, watched the entire exchange. He later said it was the most meaningful thing he had ever witnessed on any stage, and that the absence of cameras made it more powerful, not less. When I turned those cameras off, Steve said in a later interview, something changed on that stage. The performance stopped, and the real conversation started. I have seen hundreds of confrontations on my show, but they all happened under lights, with cameras, with an audience reacting. This one happened in the quiet, in the gap, as Grace would say, and the gap was where the truth lived. I sat in that front row chair and I watched a father comfort his daughter and challenge his son-in-law with the same breath. I watched a woman who helps families for a living finally help her own. And I understood, for the first time in my career, that some moments are not for television. Some moments are for families. And the best thing a host can do is recognize the difference and step aside. The episode aired in a modified format. The producers, with the Holloway family's consent, aired the first 2 rounds normally, and then showed Grace's confrontation up to the moment Steve Harvey ended the taping. The footage after the cameras officially stopped was never broadcast. Instead, Steve Harvey appeared on screen in a direct-to-camera segment recorded later, explaining his decision. I ended the show early, Steve said in the segment. First time in my career. And I want to tell you why. A woman named Grace Holloway stood on my stage and told the truth about her marriage. She did it 11 months after burying her mother, a hospice nurse who spent her life teaching people not to carry their truths in silence. Grace carried her truth for 11 months, and when she finally spoke it, she did it with the composure of a family counselor and the courage of a woman honoring her mother's last lesson. I watched her face. I listened to her words. And I realized that what was about to happen between that husband and wife was not something 200 strangers and a camera crew should witness. It was something that belonged to them. So I made the call. I ended the show, I turned off the cameras, and I sat in the front row as a witness, not a host, because Grace asked for witnesses, and I was honored to be one. The modified episode became the most discussed Family Feud broadcast of the year, not because of a viral confrontation clip, since the most important moments were never filmed, but because of the decision itself. Steve Harvey choosing to end the show early became the story. Media analysts, television critics, and cultural commentators all weighed in. The consensus was striking in its unanimity. What Steve Harvey did was the most powerful thing he had ever done on television, precisely because it was the moment he chose to stop doing television. A television critic for a major newspaper wrote, "In an era of content at all costs, Steve Harvey looked at a family in pain and decided their pain was not content. He turned off the cameras. In doing so, he made the most compelling television of his career. The screen went dark, and the darkness said more than any speech he has ever given." Grace returned to Durham and went back to work at the mental health center. She and Nathan entered couples counseling with a therapist Grace trusted, someone outside her professional network who could provide the objectivity that Grace knew she could not provide for her own marriage. The process was slow, painful, and ongoing. Grace told Jeanette that she did not know whether the marriage would survive. "But I am not carrying the silence anymore," she said. "Whatever happens, I spoke. Mama would be proud of that." Reverend Avery did not give public interviews. He returned to his pulpit and continued preaching every Sunday. But church members said his sermons changed after the experience. They became more direct, more personal. He spoke more frequently about the gap between what people profess and what they practice, and about the courage required to confront that gap instead of decorating it. One congregant told a reporter, "Reverend Avery always preached about truth. But after that show, He started preaching about the cost of truth. He started talking about what it takes to say the hard thing out loud. And we all knew he was talking about his daughter, and we all leaned in a little harder. Jeanette gave one interview after the episode aired. She said, "My sister sat in our father's study and told him that her husband had been having an affair for 2 years. Our father, who married them, who prayed for their marriage every night, sat across from his daughter and heard that the man he welcomed into our family had been lying. And then, my sister said she was going to say it on national television, and Daddy did not try to stop her. He packed his Bible, got on the plane, and stood behind her. That is what our family does. We do not hide from hard things. We stand in them. Mama taught us that from the hospice room. The truth is not something you run from. It is something you walk into, and you bring the people who love you with you." Wanda, Grace's colleague, gave a separate interview from her professional perspective. She said, "I have been a therapist for 18 years. I have sat with hundreds of families in crisis, and I have never seen a confrontation handled with more therapeutic precision than what Grace did on that stage. She did not attack Nathan. She did not blame him. She presented the truth, contextualized it within her mother's legacy, and asked for witnesses. That is textbook family therapy delivered on a game show podium. But the part that moved me the most was what she said after the cameras stopped. She told Nathan she was going to feel it, hurt, and decide when she was ready. She gave herself permission to not have the answer immediately. In therapy, we call that holding the tension. Most people cannot do it. Grace held it on a stage with 200 people watching, and then held it again in the quiet after the cameras stopped. She is the best counselor I have ever worked with, and what she did that day was the bravest counseling session I have ever witnessed. Diane Avery's journal entry, the one about the dying woman who carried the knowledge of her husband's affair for 20 years, became a widely shared piece of writing after Grace referenced it on the show. With Grace's permission, the entry was published in a hospice care journal and later reprinted in a book of essays about end-of-life wisdom. The entry resonated with people far beyond the Family Feud audience because it articulated something universal: the weight of unspoken truth, the cost of silence, the realization, often arriving too late, that the conversation you were afraid to have was the one that mattered most. Diane Avery had written it 6 years before she died, and her daughter had read it 1 week after burying her. The timing, Grace said, was her mother's final lesson, delivered from beyond the grave, through a journal entry that had been waiting patiently on a bookshelf for the exact moment it was needed. Naomi, Grace's 12-year-old daughter, asked her mother a question a few weeks after the episode aired that Grace said embodied the generational wisdom more completely than anything else that had come from the experience. They were sitting on the front porch, and Naomi said, "Mama, you help families talk about hard things every day at work. Was it harder to do it for yourself?" Grace thought about it and said, "It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Because when I am at work, I can see the path through the pain because it is not my pain. But when it is your own pain, the path disappears, and you have to walk forward anyway, trusting that the ground is there even when you cannot see it." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grandma Diane walked with dying people through pain they could not see past. Maybe that is what you did for yourself. You walked through it without seeing the other side." Grace held her daughter and understood that the lesson Diane had taught her had already reached the next generation, carried not through instruction but through observation, through the watching that children do when adults think no one is paying attention. Steve Harvey spoke about the Holloway episode at several events in the following months. At a media leadership conference, he delivered a speech that was viewed over 40 million times. "I have been in television for over 30 years, and the most important decision I have ever made in front of a camera was the decision to turn it off." On a November evening in 2026, a woman named Grace Holloway stood on my stage and spoke a truth that had been building inside her for 11 months. She did it because her mother, a hospice nurse who had just died, left behind a journal that told her not to carry the silence any longer. Grace spoke, and what came out was so honest, so measured, and so deeply personal that I knew in my gut that what was about to happen next was not for the world to see. It was for the family, so I ended the show. I turned off the cameras, and I sat down in the front row and I watched a family do what families are supposed to do. Not perform, not entertain, not go viral, just be honest with each other in a room that was finally quiet enough to hear it. He continued, "People ask me if I regret it. They ask if I wish we had kept the cameras rolling because the footage would have been the most viral clip of the year. And my answer is always the same. No. Because the footage that matters most is the footage that was never taken. The conversation that happened after the lights went down is not mine to share. It belongs to Grace and Nathan and Reverend Avery and that family. And the fact that it happened at all, the fact that a family that had been broken by lies was able to begin the process of honesty in the quiet of my darkened stage, that is worth more than any clip, any view count, any viral moment. That is what this platform is for, not for content. For people." 1 year later, Family Feud invited Grace back for a special update segment. She walked onto the stage to a standing ovation that lasted over 90 seconds. She wore a dark green dress and a simple necklace, a small glass pendant that contained a single dried white rose petal. Jeanette had made it for her, preserving a petal from the rose Diane had brought to Grace's wedding. Beside Grace, in the front row, sat Reverend Avery with his Bible in his lap, Naomi with a journal of her own, and Caleb, who was wearing a tie because Reverend Avery had told him that when your mother is being honored on television, you wear a tie. Steve hugged Grace for a long time. "Grace Holloway, a year ago I turned the cameras off for you. How are you doing?" Grace smiled. It was a complicated smile, the kind that contains both sorrow and peace, the kind her mother had probably worn 1,000 times walking out of a hospice room. "Steve, I am doing what my mother taught me. I am sitting with the hard thing and not rushing to fix it. Nathan and I are in counseling. It is not easy. Some days it feels possible. Some days it does not. But the silence is gone. The emails are on the table. The truth is in the room, and for the first time in 2 years, I do not have to carry it alone. My father stands behind me. My sister stands beside me. My daughter, who is 12 years old, already understands more about honesty than most adults learn in a lifetime. And my mother, who is not here, is everywhere. In the journal entry that woke me up, in the rose petal around my neck. In every session I sit through at work where I help a family say the thing they are afraid to say. She is in all of it, Steve. She left before I was ready, but she left me everything I needed." Steve nodded slowly. His eyes were wet. "Grace, a year ago you asked for witnesses. I turned off the cameras and I sat in the front row and I was your witness. And I want to tell you what I witnessed. I witnessed a woman who helps other families through their darkest moments finally help her own. I witnessed a father who married his daughter to a man and then stood behind her when that man broke the promise. I witnessed a family that chose honesty over comfort, truth over performance, and real conversation over the cameras that were ready to broadcast it. And I witnessed myself making the best decision of my career, turning off the lights. Because some moments are not for television. Some moments are for families. And your family, Grace, is the reason I will always know the difference." The audience rose one final time. The ovation was long and warm and carried the specific quality of sound that only happens when a room full of people is clapping not for entertainment, but for something they recognize as true. Reverend Avery sat in the front row with his Bible and did not clap. He simply bowed his head, the way he did at the end of every service, and offered a silent prayer. Naomi held her journal against her chest, and Grace stood on the stage where, 1 year earlier, she had spoken the truth her mother had taught her not to carry in silence, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular lightness that comes not from resolution but from honesty. The weight was not gone, the marriage was not fixed, the pain was not over, but the silence was broken. The truth was spoken. The cameras had stopped, and in the quiet that followed, the Holloway family had begun the slow, imperfect, sacred work of finding out whether a bridge that had been broken could be rebuilt. Not by an engineer this time, by the people who had to cross it. If this story reminded you that some truths are too important to carry in silence, that the bravest thing a person can do is speak even when they do not know what comes next, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a camera can do is stop recording. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. We bring you the most incredible and emotional family feud moments every single week. Real families, real honesty, and the courage to say the thing you have been holding inside. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.